Hey guys, my name is Anthony, and in today's video I'm going to be doing another race analysis, and in this video I'm going to be talking about how to transition from dry to wet conditions and from wet conditions to dry conditions. And for this race analysis we're going to be using footage from a guy who really needs no introduction in this community, TRL Limitless. So he did a race at Austria yesterday, and I'm actually doing the same race today later on at 8 PM GMT. So if you want to see me race tonight, then make sure to subscribe to the channel if you're not, so that you can be notified of when the stream goes live. So if you're new to the channel and you don't know what my race analysis videos are, basically I take somebody's footage and I will look at some of the more critical laps within the race, and I'll sort of talk over why I think they made the decisions they made, and I'll also talk about at least something in the video that really helps you guys improve, also helping myself improve when it comes to league races. And I'll also be talking about the race strategies in these videos, and I'll also be giving you an overview of the track. So I'll take one of the quickest laps, or I'll just take a lap and I'll sort of talk over it and give you guys instructions of how to take the track. And at the end, because a lot of people are new to the game and they don't really understand how the pit lane works, I will cover where to brake when it comes to entering the pits during these races. So for the first segment of the video, we're going to be talking about the race strategies that you can do at Austria. And sadly, Austria isn't as interesting as tracks like France or tracks like Canada, where you can do one stops, but you can also do two stops. So when it comes to the top 10, you're going to be on softer hards. I do believe softer mediums is possible, but you're at a very high risk of a puncture, so that's why I'm not really recommending that strategy. And if you're outside of the top 10, then you're probably going to want to either do the same as the top 10, because the alternate strategy isn't really as effective around a track like Austria. Or if you do want to do the alternate strategy, you're pretty much doing hards to softs. Again, I'm not 100% sure if strategies like softer mediums or mediums to softs really work. I think you're at a very high risk of a puncture. However, there is a slight chance that you can make it work depending on your tyre wear. So really and truly, I'll just take a look at the tyre wear and see if the strategy will work for you, but it is very risky. So moving on to the actual race now, and as you can see, we're all the way at lap 19, because this is when things start to get interesting. This is where the mixed conditions starts to come in, and as you can see now, JD is coming up to turn 3, and as he comes off the exit of turn 3, that's when it starts to rain. Jeff had been saying that the rain was imminent for a few laps now, and as you can see, the raindrops are falling. So when it comes to mixed conditions, whether it's going from dry to wet or wet to dry, it doesn't matter where you are on the track in terms of track position. Your only goal at this point is to be ahead of your teammate, because once you're ahead of your teammate, you get to decide when you get to pit, and your teammate has to adapt to whatever it is that you do. Luckily in this race, JD's teammate Sparks had actually gotten taken out, or he spun. So luckily for JD, he was in a position where he could pit wherever he wanted. However, in situations like, I think it was his race at France, where Sparks was ahead of him, he had to adapt his race to whatever Sparks did, and I think he had to go an extra lap on those slick tires, and it just caused a lot of problems and basically ruined his strategy and just ruined his race. So when it comes to these mixed conditions, when you're in league races, your main goal is to be ahead of your teammate. If you're ahead of your teammate, then you get all the advantage, because you get to decide when you pit, and you can pit at the right time. So speaking of the right time, what is the right time to actually pit? How do you know when it's time to pit, if it's dry going into wet or if it's wet going into dry? Well, the biggest factor you want to look at really is the delta and just how it feels on track. A very big indicator is whether or not DRS is enabled or disabled. If it's going from dry to wet, you can really get a good indication if the DRS is disabled, because then that's basically the steward saying that the track is too wet for DRS, which is usually an indication that it's time to go on intermediate tires. However, it doesn't always come very quickly, so you really want to see how the track feels. Is there a lot of grip on the track still? And mainly take a look at your delta if you can, because if you're in a position similar to JD, where you did basically half race in dry conditions, then you've already got a faster fastest lap put in, and you can compare that fastest lap to the lap times that you're doing now. If you see that the delta is only like say half a second slower than the fastest lap and you still feel as if there's a lot of grip, then clearly it's not wet enough to go into the pits. However, if you look at your first sector time, for example, and you see that you're maybe 3 seconds, 4 seconds, or maybe even like 5 seconds slower than your fastest lap, then at that point you really want to consider going into the pits, because it's probably the crossover period where the intermediate tires are now faster than the dry tires. I seen a lot of people in JD's stream yesterday telling him to box and basically saying that he should have boxed a lot earlier for the intermediate tires, and really and truly I think he pitted at roughly the right time. Maybe he could have waited a lap more once you guys see the footage here, but I feel as if he made the correct decision, because for quite a long time the track wasn't really getting slippery and he was still only like say a second slower than his fastest lap. So moving on to lap 24 now, it's been about 5 laps since it started raining and the DRS actually still hasn't been disabled yet. So at this point, JD has to make a judgment call whether or not he feels the track is getting wet enough to just go into the intermediate tires before the DRS is disabled. So let's look at the first sector time here. He's only roughly a second slower than his fastest lap. However, the track, as you can see, is getting a little bit more slippery. When it comes to different compounds, the mediums obviously have more grip than the hard tires, so Octez in front of him is having a little bit more of a tough time being in these conditions because he's on the harder compound of tires. He doesn't have as much grip on the track as JD on the mediums, and then he's got João Pedro behind him on the soft tires, and if those soft tires are roughly, you know, still fresh, then he's going to be quicker because again he has more grip. And then moving on to the second sector, you can see he was almost 4 seconds slower than his fastest time. So from the first sector to the second sector, it had become wet enough. So JD decides to make the judgment call to dive into the pits to change the intermediate tires, because at this point the track is getting a little bit more slippery now, and the delta times are suggesting that the intermediate tires are probably going to be the quicker tire at this point, even though that the DRS hasn't been disabled yet. And I think it was a lap later or 2 laps later when the DRS was finally disabled. So I think he made the right judgment call here, because at this point he had a lap or 2 to really get the tires a little bit warmed up, so that when DRS was disabled, basically the steward saying that it is wet enough, his tires are already warmed up to the track and he can already feel the grip compared to the other drivers who are maybe just pitting at that point. So as we come up to the end of lap 25 now, let's take a look of how to take Austria in wet conditions. So coming up to the first corner, brake just before the 100-meter board, JD decides to take the curb, and he doesn't take as much inside curb in the wet conditions. You really need to have a lot of car control if you want to be braking on the curbs around this track. So moving on to the third turn now, as you can see, he decides not to take any curb going into this corner, braking just before the 100-meter board, and this is when the DRS was disabled. JD doesn't short shift straight up to 4th gear, and it causes a little bit of wheel spin, so he probably should have short shift up to 4th gear instead of just 3rd. And then moving on to this corner now, again just before the 100-meter board, he decides to not take outside curb, but does take a little bit of inside curb. Again, it's really due to confidence whether or not you can take the curbs in wet conditions. And then that corner just before the 50-meter board, down into 4th gear, try not to be as aggressive on the throttle as you would be in dry conditions, of course. And then for this corner, usually you'd be in 5th, but he goes down to 4th just to get the car rotated around a little bit more. And then coming up to the final 2 corners, again just before the 50-meter board, down into 6th, really takes a lot of car control and throttle control to really keep the car stable, because that corner is pretty difficult in dry conditions, let alone in wet conditions. And that is a lap of Austria in intermediate conditions. And then moving on to the final segment, which is the pit lane entry. The pit lane starts at the penultimate corner and then takes the inside line into the pits. Some leagues don't mind if you use more of the outside track to gain some time going into the pits. However, some leagues do mind that, so you really want to check with your tier coordinators or whoever it is that's running the league to make sure whether or not you should stick to the inside line when it comes to the pit lane, or if you can go towards the outside. And then when braking, you want to brake as if if the pit lane was any other braking zone, probably around about the 100 meter to the 120 meter mark, and then just try and get the car slowed down as soon as you can. If you get the car slowed down a bit too much, just put the pit lane limiter on, because it's better to go a little bit slower into the pits than it is to speed and get a 5-second stop and go penalty. So that's going to be it for today's race analysis on TRL Limitless and how to transition from dry conditions into wet conditions, and you pretty much do the exact opposite when it comes from wet conditions to dry conditions. So if you're new to this channel, make sure to hit the subscribe button down below for more content like this, and also hit the like button as it lets me know that you guys are still finding this content valuable. And also make sure to follow me on Twitter and join my Discord for extra help from me and other members. Both links are in the description, and I'll see you guys in my next video.